New Year, we had somebody who wrote a question to us and wanted to know, what do we mean by Judeo-Christian? It's a term that some people have a problem with and and don't really understand. And if you go poking around and looking in dictionaries, you only get. I found that you only get really part of the story, and there's a great deal of misconception and misunderstanding about this. The idea that a common Judeo-Christian ethics or a Judeo-Christian, moral system or Judeo-Christian values, this overall concept has long underpinned the Western world's democratic politics, its laws, its morals, our society. It's been part of our, as it were, the word is used, our civil religion. And this has especially been true in a place like the United States of America, where the understanding or where the discussion of Judeo-Christian ethics or morals has been most vivid. America's founding fathers provided the country's founding documents such as the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and others. They wrote these documents, and in order for those founders to develop and to come up with such documents, they had to lean upon some common understanding that they had. Those 13 colonies of those different people from different areas of the United Kingdom and people from other places, Western Europe. They had to have a common understanding of law, government, social order, and a basic moral code to create the nation, to create a new nation. These understandings that these American founders came up with sprang from a common acceptance of what had come to be known as the Judeo-Christian ethic. Now, there have long been those commentators who have argued that a few of America's founding fathers were not Christians at all, but rather they were deists. They had this sort of idea that God had sort of created things and then gone away and left it to run on their own. They had their own particular take on it, people like probably Thomas Jefferson. But, whether such people were, some of these founders were Christians or not, their writings and words, and as well as their votes, indicate that the vast majority of them, they embraced the Bible, composed of the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Covenant Greek Scriptures. You had the Old Covenant Hebrew Scriptures, the New Covenant Greek Scriptures, the shorthand Judeo-Christian Scriptures. As a basis, the founders embraced this book as a basis for civilized society and social order. In recent years, when you use the phrase Judeo-Christian or Judeo-Christian morality or Judeo-Christian ethics, it tends to be always associated in the public's mind now, and especially it's portrayed in the media's mind, as it's associated with political conservatives. Notable people like in the United States, like Ronald Reagan. President Ronald Reagan, who maybe some people, he's recognized as the great American president now, but, if you've been around a little while, you recognize that when he came into office and was elected, there was a lot of hand-wringing and people saying, oh, they didn't say alt-right or far-right now, but the people on the other side of the aisle, the Democratic, the leftist side of the aisle, they had some pretty awful things to say about President Reagan during his administration while he was actually running the government down in the United States. Anyways, this President Reagan frequently emphasized Judeo-Christian values as necessary ingredients in the fight against communism. Now, that seems a little quaint these days because we think, well, communism is past. We don't have to worry about it or something like that. But anyways, Reagan would argue that the Bible contains all the answers to the problems that face us. That's close quote. Reagan disapproved of the growth of secularism that he saw taking place in the United States during his administration, and he emphasized the need to take the idea of sin seriously, that there is sin. You know, many people who would listen to that think, well, how quaint. Nevertheless, the concept of a common Judeo-Christian morality or ethic, though it was not always expressed in that using that exact term or terminology, you know, this concept has frequently been featured in the rhetoric of leaders from across the political spectrum in the United States, including, you know, presidents, Democratic, you know, and they would have seen as left presidents such as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, but there were also presidents like Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan, even Bill Clinton, who would use this phrase Judeo-Christian morality or Judeo-Christian ethic. For instance, you know, one interesting thing in the first inaugural address of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, in 1933, and remember, this was the height of the Depression, when really America was flat on its back. And there was a large percentage of the population that was without work. You know, large numbers. People were even hungry. When you look back and you look at perhaps some documentaries on the Depression of the 1930s, it's really gritty. But in his famous speech there, in his inaugural speech, in which he declared the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, because many people were afraid, FDR included numerous religious references. In that speech, FDR attacked the bankers and promised a reform in the echo of the gospel. And he would say, he quote, FDR said, "The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit." FDR was appealing. You know, he's appealing to concepts that come from the Bible about this. Historians stress that Roosevelt believed his welfare programs, all the things he came to try to take care of people, to keep them from starving, to try to keep, you know, the nation moving forward and not, you know, tear apart at the seams at a time when the economy collapsed or took a great leap backwards and was unable to provide for many people in the nation. We're always in danger of that these days, you know. We're not out of the woods yet on this. But anyways, Roosevelt saw the achievement of social justice through government action as being morally superior to the old laissez-faire approach of his predecessor, Herbert Hoover. He used to talk about all the homeless camps, calling them Hoovervilles, from this standpoint. He proclaimed this, and I'll quote from Roosevelt, "The thing we are seeking is justice," as guided by the concept of do unto your neighbor as you would be done by. So Roosevelt, in his first address, coming to the office of presidency at a time of national crisis, of financial collapse, economic regression in the United States, appealed to the scriptures to calm and to comfort the people. The biographer Randall Woods, argued that President Lyndon B. Johnson would effectively use appeals to the Judeo-Christian ethical tradition in order to gather together support for his civil rights law of 1965, in which he wanted to do something about ending desegregation, racial segregation in the United States of America at that time. Johnson's decision to define civil rights as a moral issue and to wield the nation's self-professed Judeo-Christian ethics as a sword in its behalf constituted something of a watershed in the 20th century political history. course, you could say, and people also like Martin Luther King did the same thing. They appealed to the Judeo-Christian ethic for the support to gather, the support from the nations to say this is what is just and this is what is right. Both Johnson and Martin Luther King would do that. While liberal Democratic presidents like FDR and Lyndon Johnson, in the past were fond of evoking the Judeo-Christian ethic, modern day, of course, liberal politicians these days, tend to shun such spiritual lessons. I mean, you don't hear them really talking about it that often. You really don't. I think Bill Clinton was maybe the last one that really did that in a significant way. Alex de Tocqueville, when he came to he was a Frenchman, visited the United States when it was, at that point in time it was the 1830s. So he really came to the United States before it had been established as a nation, 50 years, because America only became really established as a nation, recognized in 1783 anyways. So he was there within 50 years after it was established. Tocqueville, wandering around the new country, he made a whole variety of observations, which I think these days are really quite amazing. But one of the things, and I'll cite a couple of the quotes from them. He said, "Liberty cannot be established without morality, nor morality without faith." That's a profound statement. And maybe it should be a worrying statement, because there are many, whether it's my country, Canada, or the United States of America, think that liberty can be established without the morality that is discussed in the Bible, or you could have some sort of morality without the faith in the Word of God. He also said, Tocqueville, and I'll quote, he said, "I sought for the greatness and genius of America in her commodious harbors." In other words, the beautiful natural harbors. New York, Philadelphia, others. "And her ample rivers, and it was not there. In her fertile fields and boundless forests, and it was not there. In her rich mines and in her vast world commerce, and it was not there. In her democratic Congress and her matchless Constitution, and it was not there. Not until I went into the churches of America and heard her pulpits aflame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and power. America is great because she is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great." That's Alexis de Tocqueville in his book, Democracy in America. Something to profoundly think about. Profoundly think about. Dictionary.com, if you're going to Google it, Judeo-Christian, you Google Judeo-Christian, it says, "of or relating to the religious writings, beliefs, values, and traditions held in common by Judaism and Christianity, such as the Ten Commandments." And of course, the Ten Commandments in a variety, in front of a variety of American state houses. They used to have monuments that were posted there. And I think they still have them for the most part, because I think the courts finally came down and said, well, it's part of our history or something. And, the Judeo-Christian, our Judeo-Christian tradition, history. And one of the things, so I want to talk, that when you look at Judeo-Christian morality, what are some of the prime features? Well, according to Dr. Richard Lee, who's editor of the American Patriots Bible, there are 7 broad principles of the Judeo-Christian ethic. And, I thought I was going to be able to get through all 7 of these today. Oh, no, I'm not going to be able. There's far more. But we'll see how far we get. We'll see how far we get. But let's take, what are, when we talk about Judeo-Christian morality, Judeo-Christian ethic, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? I mean, this broadcast, is sponsored by the Judeo-Christian Foundation. So what are we talking about? Anyways, the number one principle, according to Dr. Lee, is this. Dr. Richard Lee. He says, principle number one, the dignity of human life. And he goes, and and it's very easy to do this. You can quote Exodus in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah. Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, and the statement was repeated in the second giving of the law just before the Israelites would come. See, the first in Exodus was when they came out from being slaves in the land of Egypt. That's Exodus 20:13, and then the citation in Deuteronomy 5:17 was before they were supposed to go into their promised land and actually govern themselves. So what was it? This dignity, the principle number one, the dignity of human life. And what is it? It is as the commandments state, out of the 10 commandments, you shall not murder. It's a principle of law. This is a categorically made statement, made without qualification. You shall not murder. Many translations put it, will say you shall not kill, but that's not what it's saying. Because the scriptures always said people who took human life, who did things worthy of death, were to be judged appropriately and legally by the courts, and they could be executed and should be executed. Scriptures very clearly believe in capital punishment. That's one of the things, after the Bible goes on, after the flood, it was something that God was going to require people. It was this level of justice. Of course, we ignore that. You shall not murder. This was spoken as an eternal truth from the top, that by the YHVH, the God who spoke to ancient Israel at Mount Sinai, and was repeated once more to the Israelites before they went into the promised land by Moses. And Jesus took this statement, you shall not murder, and he expanded this teaching about murder from the Hebrew Scriptures to even include murder's precursor, which is inappropriate anger. See, this is so Jesus took the concept and then he expanded it. This is, if you want to call it, Judeo-Christian morality in action. It shows how it works. Let's go to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 21. I'm going to cite the Expanded Bible version. You have heard that it was said to our people long ago. Okay, Jesus is speaking. He's speaking to a crowd there. You said, it's said to our people, and he's speaking to mostly Jews. Probably up in Galilee at this point in time. And he said, you have heard it was said to our people long ago, you must not murder. Anyone who murders another will be judged. That is, they will be subject to judgment. See, it wasn't just revenge or something like this. There was justice to be administered. Something that was being required. Anyone who murders another will be judged. Verse 22, but I tell you, Jesus said, if you are angry with a brother or a sister, you will be subject to judgment. Oh, if you actually kill somebody, if you murder them, you will be judged. You're subject to judgment. But Jesus went beyond it. Said, look, if you are angry with a brother and sister, you'll be subject to judgment. What does he mean? And in this, you have to go into the Greek, because we'd say, well, does that mean somebody does something to me and I get angry with them, and that means I'm as bad as a murderer? No, Jesus, you have to look at, you have to understand it. There's a little bit of depth you have to dig into. If you are angry with a brother and sister, he's using here in angry, it's you can check this out. Strong's 3710 is orgizo. Orgizo. To be angry means to show settled opposition. And the lexicon makes this point that this word orgizo is positive in a scriptural perspective when it is inspired by God. God will later say, be angry and sin not. See, there are things we should be angry at. Injustice in its forms. Murder. So orgizo says it's positive when inspired by God, but it is always negative when it arises from the flesh. In other words, our passions. We want revenge. We want to get even. Sinful, unnecessary anger, the lexicon goes on to say, focuses on punishing the offender, getting even, getting your pound of flesh, rather than the moral content of the offense. See, we should be angry at the sin. Going back again, what Reagan said, we really should focus on sin. And you people who go around murdering people, that act should make us angry. Because sin has its consequences, and they're terrible. But to say, to be angry with your brother and say, all right, I'm going to get even, and we've had also, Hollywood loves to produce revenge movies, somebody's aggrieved and they strap on their, guns and they, go out and blow away the bad guys, right? No, when he says, if you are angry with a brother or sister, you'll be subject to judgment, that's when, okay, you're taking the law into your own hands. You're focusing on punishing the offender rather than the moral content of the offense. So again, back again to Matthew 5 here. Talking about the Judeo-Christian morality and how it's taking the statement, you shall not murder, and how Jesus is expanding it. But I tell you, if you are angry with a brother or sister, because you're focusing on the offender rather than the moral content of the offense, you will be subject to judgment. If you say bad things in this anger, and the scriptures say raka, which is the equivalent of fool, which this is in Aramaic. Jesus was obviously speaking Aramaic at this point. It's a term of derision. If you say bad things, raka, to a brother and sister. And how many people are saying far worse things these days on the internet? That's a problem these days. If you say bad things, raka, fool, some sort of terms of derision to a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment by the council. In this case, the actual word is Sanhedrin. Those who are, legally responsible to maintaining order in society, to keeping things, to performing justice. And then it goes on, if you call someone an idiot, this is Strong's 3474. The Greek word is moros, which means you get our English word moron. If you call someone a moron, brainless, stupid, you will be in danger of the fire of Gehenna. Gehenna was this valley outside of Jerusalem where during the Old Covenant period of time, that's where, when people apostatized and started worshiping foreign gods, children would be sacrificed to a pagan god, Moloch. And later was used as a place for burning trash heap. Jesus was saying you're be subject to the danger of Gehenna, fire of Gehenna. It's a metaphor for you're in danger of perdition, of complete loss of your being. So Jesus had quite a bit to say. So you've heard it. You've heard it said in the past, Hebrew scriptures, that you should not murder, but I'm taking it a little bit farther. You shouldn't be going around and saying if you're angry with a brother or sister, if you're angry with one of your neighbors, you're looking at getting even and getting your revenge, punishing the offender, rather than just being angry at the offense, the sin. You're in danger of judgment. And if you start going around, calling people morons and fools, deriding them, brainless, stupid, you're in danger yourself. It's wrong. Why is that? I think the Apostle John expanded upon that when he wrote. Let's go to 1 John chapter 3 and verse 15. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 15. Apostle John wrote this: everyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer. And you know that no murderers have eternal life abiding or remaining in them. If you hate a brother and sister, so you have this hate, you're angry. It leads to thoughts of revenge. You're despising people. You're not focusing on the dignity of human life. See, this principle of what Judeo-Christian morality is, number one, is the principle of the dignity of human life. It's not just that you're not killing them, but you're not, treating them terribly, making them miserable, from the standpoint and taking away their dignity as a human being. Dr. Richard Lee, makes this comment. He says, if people and nations do not grant this respect and protection, this respect for the dignity of life, for the weakest, most marginal parts of society, whether they're born or unborn, all of their professed morals and values are meaningless, because they are no longer undergirded by the most basic of human needs, the need to exist. Of course, this is why, with this, having the respect for the dignity of life, this is why the whole issue of abortion has been so front and center. The need to exist, dignity of human existence, the right to be alive. Dignity of human life. To treat the lives of fellow human beings with dignity is not just a principle of the Bible. Dr. Lee says it is the beginning principle of any civilized society. I suppose, we're becoming more and more uncivilized all the time. That's, because we are not respecting the dignity of human life the way we should, are we? Just in recent history, we have the example in the 20th century of the Nazis and Stalin, Mao's, and Pol Pot's communists, who treated people like insects. A resource, which you can make soap or fertilizer. Solzhenitsyn had a lot to say about the gulags of Stalin. Pol Pot, it's just horrible how these people treated other people. They didn't respect the dignity of life. They were, completely alienated and, completely unconnected to the Judeo-Christian morality. The biggest massacres, the genocides of people who are unconnected with the Judeo-Christian morality. And in the 21st century, we have the Islamic jihadists and whatever other sorts of terrorists who go around and plant bombs in public places to kill whoever happens to be walking along or coming by. They also don't respect the dignity of human life because they are disconnected from the Judeo-Christian morality. Jesus talked about this. This is a danger. Because many of the elite who are governing our society, the political and cultural social elite, want to totally disconnect from any sort of reference to the Judeo-Christian morality and ethics is going to create problems, is creating problems, will create a lot more problems. Let's go to Matthew chapter 6 and verse 22. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 22. Jesus said this, The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is clear, that means if your eye is spiritually perceptive, tuned in to the moral logic of the universe, to the Judeo-Christian ethic and morality, your whole body will be full of light because it's going to benefit from all of God's precepts, from what he teaches in this book. Verse 23, but if your eye is bad, if you are spiritually blind because you've turned your back on the Judeo-Christian morality, your whole body will be full of darkness, devoid of God's precepts, God's teachings, and the blessings that come from following them. So if the very light inside you, in your inner self, in your heart, in your conscience, in your public policy is darkness, how great and terrible is that darkness? That's a remarkable thing to think about. You know, it really is. It's a remarkable thing. Because, you think about this whole thing, that, again, as Tocqueville said, liberty cannot be established without morality, nor morality without faith, but you certainly can have totalitarian governments, can't you? Now, the second principle in Judeo-Christian ethic, according to Dr. Lee, is the traditional family. And, of course, first place you would go in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Bible, would be Genesis chapter 2 and verse 21. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam. And he slept, and he took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh in his place. Then the rib which the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman. Now, maybe in previous centuries, they would have said, this is kind of strange. But, in our day, with all of our understanding of genetic and growing things and this, that, and the other, it is remarkable that you're dealing with one of the most incredible biological designers, developers, creators in the history of the universe. So he took the rib that he had from the man, and he made it into a woman, and he brought her to him, and Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. This is, the origin of the traditional family. From the book of origins, the book of beginnings. But of course, marriage has long been problematic because of human beings and our weaknesses as human beings. Let's go to Matthew chapter 19. Jesus talked about this. Society has long, fallen short of what God's ideal was. And Jesus brought this up. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 3. I'm going to read this in the Amplified Bible version. And Pharisees, people who, took what was here and began extrapolating from it from how they wanted to run society. Okay, so they say, we'll use this, and then we'll make further developments on this. And the Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him. Okay, they were looking for grounds to accuse him, and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? Because the idea was back then, you could say if you were a Pharisee, if your wife burnt the boiling water, or burnt dinner, a guy could say, I divorce you, and get rid of his wife. And that's where the Pharisees were coming from. It's sort of like, in many ways, you have the current thing, like in India, they recently passed, I think it was the Supreme Court, they're no longer going to allow the Muslims in that country to use Sharia, which is in the, out of the Islamic codes of saying that a Islamic man, not woman, by the way, Islamic man could say to his wife, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, 3 times. It's not like you have to repeat it all at once either. So a lot of them said if they say it just 3 times, out of anger, she's out of there, But is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? And Jesus replied, have you never read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? Again, quoting from Genesis, looking at the Hebrew scriptures, Jesus said, and said, for this reason, because he made them male and female, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined inseparably to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer 2, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. But the Pharisees wanted easy divorce. They wanted easy divorce, no fault divorce. Just let's have a merry-go-round, serial polygamy. The Pharisee said to him, why then did Moses command us to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? Moses didn't command them, by the way. No one was commanded, from that aspect to do the divorce thing. And Jesus said to them, why that was included in the scriptures, that they did allow for divorce. Because your hearts were hard and stubborn, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not this way. That wasn't God's intent. Because of all the problems it creates in society, for all the heartaches it creates for individuals and people. My parents are divorced. More than 50 years after my parents' divorce, my father was still occupied, a heartache, bitterness part of his personality. 50 years. It never leaves you. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, Jesus said, except for sexual immorality. And another place in Scripture would say also physical abuse. Jesus wasn't trying to be totally categorical in this. Except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. So very clearly, the Judeo-Christian ethic wanted very clearly to support, to nourish their traditional family. It's a foundation for a healthy society. So he said, no, I'm not going for the easy divorce thing. Oh, no. We're going to have, except for sexual immorality and marries another woman, he commits adultery. No merry-go-round. No, that's not what the human family needs. The disciples said to Jesus, they're all sitting there listening to him talk with to the Pharisees, and he said, if a relationship of a man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry. This is a pretty high standard. Now we're getting nervous, because some of these guys were married. Now, it doesn't talk about all their marriages. We know Peter was married, very clearly. But Jesus said to his disciples, he said this, not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom the capacity to receive, as the Amplified would add, it has been given. So it applies to only those who have the capacity to do it. And then he goes on to explain, verse 12, for there are eunuchs, people who have been born that way from their mother's womb, which means it makes them incapable of consummating a marriage, sustaining a marriage, because they can't have sexual relations with their wife. They can't do that. There are eunuchs who have been born that way from their mother's wombs, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men. Here you have the story of Daniel. You have the story of Nehemiah, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Those who served in the the courts of the royalty of the pagan kings. Well, they were eunuchs. They had their little operation that they did in those days. No, they couldn't be married. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves so for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Whoever is able to receive this, let him accept it. Two of those, Jesus himself never married. Unlike, Muhammad, who had, his 20 some odd wives and whatever. Jesus didn't marry because he knew he had the job of being the sacrifice to pay the sins of mankind. And so anybody who would be crucified, he was a state criminal, and all his property would be confiscated, and all the problems that were. That's why Jesus had to have the Apostle John take care of his mother, because she had whatever she had was confiscated by the state. So Jesus didn't want to inflict that on somebody, so he didn't get married. Dr. Richard Lee notes that the biblical view of marriage and family is the basis of our society and serves as the backbone of a healthy social order. The clear plan of God involves a man and a woman producing children within the institution of marriage. When God's definition of marriage and family are no longer respected, these institutions become meaningless, and world history has proven over and over again that preserving the traditional family is vital to the future of any great nation. Because, of course, what happens when the traditional family structure breaks down is society becomes overwhelmed with social problems of all sorts. Why do you think we have such high levels of depression and suicide and drug addiction and all these things? Let's go to Ephesians chapter 3. Ephesians chapter 3. This emphasis, the Judeo-Christian morality, this emphasis on the traditional family, it's very strong in the Bible, and it's strong not just for a purely physical reason, but also for a spiritual reason. Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 13, Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 3:13, Amplified Bible version. So I ask you not to lose heart. Apostle Paul is writing to the church at Ephesus. I ask you not to lose heart at my sufferings on your behalf. He was then sitting in jail. Because, he'd upset some of the local people, speaking against idolatry, that is, putting things before the worship of the true God. So not to lose heart at my sufferings on your behalf, for they are your glory and honor. For this reason, grasping the greatness of this plan by which Jews and Gentiles are joined together in Christ, for this reason, because he had an idea that, the scriptures were not just for one ethnic group of humanity, but for all of humanity. See, that was one of the things that expanded the Christian part of the Judeo-Christian morality, is it was for everyone. I bow my knees in reverence before the Father, the Apostle Paul said. He uses the word Father, for whom every family in heaven and earth derives its name. God the Father is the first and ultimate Father of humanity. And then verse 16 he goes on, may he grant you out of the riches of his glory to be strengthened and spiritually energized with power through his Spirit in your inner self, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and may you, having been deeply rooted and securely grounded in love. The idea, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and earth derives its name. The Greek word for father is patria, which also we get country or nation. And family is patria, and it comes from the word pater for father. The whole concept it was very interesting. The editors of the Amplified, because they put a footnote there. The whole concept of the traditional family originates with God. Of course, you know, this whole thing that because the traditional family, the concept originates with God, you know, that's why in the traditional family, this is why it's a prominent key component of the ongoing culture wars that are tearing our Western societies apart. Because, of course, you know, we look at, again, the great numbers of our politicians and the cultural elites who are directing and are leading the society, they're thinking that, oh, we don't need the traditional family anymore. We can just jettison it. And it's no wonder that they take offense at the whole idea of Judeo-Christian morality and ethic. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 14. Here the Apostle Paul is talking to the Corinthians who live in one of the most licentious, morally loose cities of the ancient world, Corinth. You know, they had, to Corinthianize, taking the name of the town or the city, to Corinthianize meant to, just go out and have, sexual hedonism. They had their temple for Diana and all these other things where you could go up and, which temple prostitutes do you want today? Anyways, Paul wrote these people and he said to them, do not be unequally bound together with unbelievers. And here it's very clearly, you can't expand it to business perhaps and business arrangements, but, Paul had very distinctively in mind sexual immorality of just having sex with whomever you want outside of the traditional family. Do not be unequally bound with unbelievers, people who don't believe. For what partnership can righteousness have with lawlessness? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony can there be between Christ and Belial, which is another word for Satan? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God. Just as God said, I will dwell among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So come out from unbelievers and be separate, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean, and I will graciously receive you and welcome you with favor, and I will be a father to you, and you will be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. See, God's idea, the traditional family, it was a model for the spiritual family of what he is, wants to do, for all eternity, bringing people into his family, adopting them, as it were. Let's go to next, the third principle of the Judeo-Christian ethic or morality is a work ethic. A work ethic. This is what Dr. Lee has to say. And cites Proverbs chapter 12, verse 27, whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but the diligent man will get precious wealth. Here we are not slothful, but we're diligent in our work. Of course, when you think about the work ethic that is taught in the Hebrew Scriptures, probably one of the most famous spots where it really elaborates it in detail of what God intended as the proper role model was this Proverbs 31, chapter 10, talking about the woman of valor, the woman of noble character. This is the ideal. Who can find, Proverbs 31:10, who can find a virtuous and capable wife? She is more precious than rubies. Her husband can trust her, and she will greatly enrich his life. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She finds wool and flax and busily spins it. She is like a merchant's ship bringing her food from afar. She gets up before dawn to prepare breakfast for her household and plan the day's work for her servant girls. She's a manager, too. She goes to inspect a field and buys it. Ooh, own property and all this sort of stuff. The Bible had a lot to, very high role here for women. They're not inferiors. She gets up before dawn, prepares breakfast. She goes to inspect a field and buys it. With her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She is energetic and strong, a hard worker. She makes sure her dealings are profitable. Her lamp burns late in the night. Her hands are busy spinning thread, her fingers twisting fiber. She extends, because of course, in the ancient world, you couldn't go down to the thrift store and buy cheap clothing or go to the mall and pick up to the clothing store and buy. No, you had to make it yourself, which, required a lot of work and to keep at it, because it took a long time to make cloth. She extends a helping hand to the poor and opens her arms to the needy. She has no fear of winter for a household, for everyone has warm clothes. She makes her own bread spreads. She dresses in fine linen and purple gowns. Her husband is well known in the city gates. He sits with the other civic leaders. She makes belted linen garments and sashes to sell to the merchants. She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future. When she speaks, her words are wise. She gives instructions with kindness. She carefully watches everything in her household and suffers nothing from laziness. Yeah, the work ethic was strongly taught in the Hebrew Scriptures. So it's hardly surprising, as it is Judeo-Christian morality. Where do we go from that? Well, the Apostle Paul, who knew the Scriptures backward and forwards, said this in 2 Thessalonians 3:10. In writing to the church, he said, "For even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat." The idea was that if one is able but unwilling to work to provide for himself or his family, it is unjust for him to receive the necessities of life provided free by those who work willingly. Of course, this is always from this aspect, this is how you keep a society moving together. Everyone has an expectation. And when you violate that, and you have confiscatory taxes, then you diminish the desire to work. And then you have problems in our society. It is important. In the New Covenant Greek scriptures, Christian scriptures, if you would, Jesus himself made the point that, we should have a diligent work ethic. And he makes this point, it's a spiritual point, but he uses a financial example. Let's go to Matthew chapter 25 and verse 13. And Jesus said this in teaching. He said, "Therefore be on the alert, be prepared and ready, for you don't know the day or hour when the Son of Man will come." See, that's one of the major promises in the Scriptures, that Jesus will return a second time and reestablish the kingdom of God on earth. See, this is the hope, what gospel taught of the gospel of the coming kingdom of God. It wasn't you go to heaven when you're dead. No, he said we're going to change what's happening here on this world. That's a different point. Verse 14. "For it is just like a man who is about to take a journey," which here the metaphor is, I'm going to be gone, right? I'm leaving town. About to take a journey, and he called his servants together and entrusted them with his possessions. To one he gave 5 talents. A talent was a measure of money, a weight, usually 58 to 80 pounds of silver, which was money, kesef. In Hebrew, silver was money. Of course, a talent of gold was worth even more than that. But a talent of silver amounted to like 15 years worth of wages. So it was a significant amount of money. So he gave to one person 5 talents, or the equivalent of 75 years of wages for him to financially manage and put to work. To another 2 talents, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. Then he went on his journey. He had his money managers taking his money and doing something with it. They were to be occupy and be busy. The one who had received the 5 talents, verse 16, went at once and traded with them and made a profit and gained 5 more. He got into the import-export business or manufacturing or whatever it might have been. Likewise, the one who had 2, made a profit and gained 2 more. He said, but the odd thing was the one who had just the 1 talent of money, 15 years worth of wages, just went and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money and didn't do anything with it, didn't work with it to try to increase it. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. And the one who had received the 5 talents came and brought him 5 more, saying, Master, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I have made a profit and gained 5 more talents. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful and trustworthy over a little. I will put you in charge of many things. Share in the joy of your master. We're going to party. And he did the same thing with the 2. It's proportional. You did a good job. You went out and worked with it. Yeah, it's a spiritual concept of using the spiritual values or the knowledge, the understanding, the gifts that he gives us. And elsewhere in the scriptures, in the New Covenant scriptures, it talks about, Jesus gives gifts to men. We receive those gifts, and we should employ them to his profit and glory. But he's using, of course, in teaching this, a work ethic. Something that is very important. Because it goes down here, let's go down in verse, the one who didn't do anything. Let's go to verse 26, or verse 25, when he comes and he asks, or even verse 24, the one who received the 1 talent also came forward when he was called to account, saying, Master, I knew you to be a harsh and demanding man, reaping the harvest where you didn't sow and gathering where you didn't scatter seed, So I was afraid to lose a talent, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. See, I have with your own, but I didn't do anything. I didn't work with it. But his master asked her, you wicked, lazy servant. You knew, did you, that I don't reap where I don't harvest where I sowed or didn't sow, and all these things. But he said you should have done something with the opportunities I gave you. You should have worked with them. And in verse 29, he concludes, For to everyone who has and values his blessings and gifts from God's and employs them, works with diligently with what he has given, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But those who don't work with what they are given, he has ignored, disregarded the blessings and gifts from God, even what he has will be taken away, and throw out the worthless servant into outer darkness. There will be weeping and grinding of teeth. Weeping over sorrow of missed opportunities, grinding of teeth, anger and resentment. Because we're supposed to do it. Dr. Richard Lee concludes this point here, the Judeo-Christian ethic of, working. He says this. He writes that ingrained deep within the American spirit is the willingness and desire to give an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. The independent spirit has no desire to exist on handouts from the government or to siphon off a living, from charity. It is this independent spirit that has allowed America to create the greatest and strongest economy in the world. That's what Dr. Lee had to say. Well, I've run out of time for this point, and we're going to continue it because there is so much to be said about it. But here we've said, there are the 3 aspects of what is the Judeo-Christian morality or the Judeo-Christian ethic. You're talking about this, talking about the sanctity of life. The sanctity of life. And it is Judeo-Christian because, while the Hebrew scriptures talk, you're not to murder, Jesus is saying, you're not to even speak angrily. Or you're not to hate people, despise people. And then the Judeo-Christian morality also emphasizes their traditional family as the foundation for what is good. And very clearly, Jesus taught, that this whole idea of easy divorce or whatever, is not from God. It is, and is not going to, a society that ignores these things. There are always terrible consequences, and we are reaping these things right now. And finally, that the Judeo-Christian morality teaches, yes, we should be out there working, doing our best, support ourselves and be able to support others. As Apostle Paul even taught the thieves, he said, look, work honestly with your hands so you'll not only provide for your own needs, but for those of the others. And when you do that, you have a society that is at peace. Well, there's a lot more to be said. But as Tocqueville said, where is the greatness of society? It's not in, and many people look at it for just the physical attributes of what gives us power, or, it's not in the size of your army, it's not in the size of your national bank account, in this case, this national debt. It was in the source of greatness was because the people had been taught what was right. They had been taught the Judeo-Christian morality of how to live and how to treat other people. And that is what makes a people great.